Hello and welcome back to History of Philosophy and our last module here, module 14, on Guy Debord and the Situationist International. And this is a group that, although not considered philosophers per se, dealt with exactly the same content that we have been discussing since the very beginning. So I'd like to kind of do a deep dive into what is considered the last real revolutionary movement in the 1960s. And that would be Debord and the SI. So what I'd like to do is, first of all, to identify some of the main ideas, the main tenets of situationism, and then to evaluate the effectiveness of some of these different strategies. Detournement, for example, as a cultural weapon against instrumental rationality. Now, don't worry at this point if that statement makes absolutely no sense to you. That's why you're here. And then finally, the third, to assess the relevance of Debord's notion of a society of the spectacle in which today's culture and climate finds itself, because we are basically living in a kind of spectacle of mass distractions that are taking our attention away from the issues that really matter. So we're going to identify these tenets, evaluate some of them, and then assess the relevance of one of perhaps the most important ideas, which are part of Debord's main overview of capitalist society. Okay, so where do these people come from and how did they get together? Well, initially, in the late 50s, 1957 specifically, there were European avant-garde groups. They could have been mostly art groups, revolutionary avant-garde art. These groups came from Belgium, from Holland, and from France to come together to form what was called the Situationist International, or the SI. And their ideas looked back, right? Their perspective looked back to the end of the First World War and the avant-garde artists of that period, in particular those associated with Dada and with Surrealism. And what they found really fascinating with these two fields, although they did reserve criticism on both of them, what they wanted to do was to pick up the way in which they were viewing the world as already problematic. The Dadaists, for example, considered the fact of the First World War was a direct result of our enamored desire to be technological and scientific and reasonable, and of course couple all of that with nationalism, and the end result is carnage, bloodshed and carnage. So the Dadaists rejected everything that was reasonable, rational, logical, scientific, technological, rejected all of this, and sought to basically rebuild the world. And the Surrealists, who were also artists during the two wars between the first and the second, did the same sort of thing. They responded at times quite violently towards the state of affairs between the wars. So they are in existence in the 1920s. They really kind of, both groups are very busy and are in their most comprehensive phase in the 1920s. And so the Situationists took some of these ideas, and what did they want to do? What they wanted to do was to challenge people's very passive conditioning with these very carefully calculated scandals. And this, of course, has a long history in French culture, the idea of le scandale, going all the way back to art plays that would essentially insult to the audience, and people would lose their minds and revolt. It happened again in 1913 with Stravinsky's The Rite of Spring. There were riots at this point. Films often led to riots. So the Situationists kind of like that sort of thing, right, to provoke people. So what they wanted to do was provoke people out of this sort of passive, sort of consumer-oriented behavior and their conditioning, right? This is really what they were looking for. And most of it was, to a certain degree, playful. They weren't considered dangerous, although their ideas were used by others that took these ideas much, much further. But they were ready to create various scandals in order to wake people up. This is what they were trying to do. So detournement, or deturning or detouring, which is really what it means in English, detournement became part of this struggle, right? And the struggle was against what? It was against the society of the spectacle. And what they did was they, as culture jammers, which is what we'd call them today, intercepted their own opinions into that spectacle. they detoured it. They turned it on its head. They made it say what it really was trying to say, but was lying to the general public. So we have the situationists who are using sort of art techniques picked up from the Dadaists and the Surrealists to wake people up from this sort of very passive conditioning of just being a consumer, a passive consumer, not active in any way, just simply thinking about the next item to buy, the next product to buy. And they did this by, in a sense, jamming the message coming from that society, the spectacle. And in so doing, we're able to provide a critique of contemporary consumer culture and this fetishism of commodities, this fixation. These days, it's the iPhone. And prior to that, it may have been something else, a Rubik's Cube in the 1970s. But every age, every era has its own sort of commodity fetishism. And certainly these days, it's the iPhone. Certain cars are very prestigious to have. But no matter what, it's this fascination with buying the latest product. And once you get people hooked on buying iPhone 1, guess what? They'll be back for 2, 3, and 4, and all the rest of them. But all of these things were part of a kind of a larger social issue, which had to do with alienation or social anomie that we have talked about when we were talking about Durkheim, this idea that people are disconnected from the community, disconnected from one another. The things that would glue them together within that community are eroding because the economic imperatives of that age are forcing people to either move somewhere else to live, to get work, or somehow stopping individuals from maintaining these strong family ties and community ties which they had had before. So all of this was part of that general overview that the situationists had regarding society and the ways or the direction that society was headed. So issues of class alienation, cultural homogenization, a kind of general sameness. Everybody needs to buy the same iPhone, look the same, pick up the latest, fashions, mass media, and of course the same general message being broadcasted no matter where you are. And the message is typically of consumerism. So this was the target of these playful attacks by the situationists, was mass media, social conditioning, especially passive social conditioning. Those were the things that they were most interested in. Now, although he never called himself a leader, was more a director, so le directeur, as he called himself in many of his letters. The person that really is responsible for the situationists and their theoretical background was Guy-Louis Debord. So Guy Debord was a French radical Marxist cultural theorist. He was a philosopher, although he never really called himself that, but certainly very well read. He was a filmmaker, and he was originally a member of what was called the Letterist International. And so it existed between 1952 and 1957. And from that group that he actually put together as a response to a previous group called the Letterists, but let's not confuse ourselves, Debord really was the person that created both the Letterist International, who were concerned with, at that point, Detournement and artistic statements, then became the Situationist International that we know today. And it lasted from 1957 to 1972. Debord was born in Paris. He spent some time in Cannes. He lived there as a teenager, then came back to live in Paris and traveled around a lot throughout Western Europe. And then over a long period of time, as he suffered more and more from, unfortunately, alcoholism, he eventually killed himself in November of 1994. And even that is not something that is unusual in French culture. Many famous philosophers, Gilles Deleuze, that we talked about in the very first week, he also killed himself. So this is something that is kind of in the background of this whole sort of subject that we're looking at. This idea that at one point it just becomes so overwhelming that suicide is the only way out. Now, Schopenhauer told us that's not the answer, but certainly when we look at the amount of work that individuals such as Deleuze or the person we're looking at right now, Debord, they tried their best. But in this case, it was a health issue and a very serious one. And this became something that's really overwhelmed Debord, and unfortunately, he took his own life. Okay, so in our questioning of who Debord was, we have to also ask ourselves what a situationist is, right? So Debord was really a situationist first and foremost, because the kind of work that he was trying to do was one where he wished to behave in such a way that the system, that economic system, the economic system upon which politics is also based and society, he wanted to act in an unpredictable way. So he wanted to create situations. And situations would be these spontaneous aesthetic moments. They could be artistic. They would often travel late at night with walkie-talkies and flashlights and would go to parts of the city of Paris and just explore and just stay in touch with one another and just enjoy being in the moment. So the notion of a situation and being a situationist was someone concerned with creating and constructing these spontaneous moments, or loitering with intent, right? Kind of just hanging around. But the idea was to be very, very mindful and live authentically in that situated moment, to live life concretely and as a deliberate construction, something that you yourself create, and it never happens again. So it's of the moment, it's in the moment, and then it's gone. And the next day you do something else. The whole idea was to act in an unpredictable way. In other words, to not always act as if you were a passive consumer waiting for the next iPhone to come down the line. So a constructed situation was a moment of life concretely and deliberately constructed, rather than something passively accepted. And what was happening was there was an attempt to be fully aware of the situation that you were in, where you are presently at, the time of day, the people you experience, or the people that you experience this moment with, the amount of alcohol you've had to drink. That's also important because there was a lot of drinking at this point. And so these moments, what he called a unitary ambience, right, combining together a moment that individual has full control over. That's the other issue. To act in an unpredictable way, loitering with intent, but being in full control of what's going on. So you live in that moment, in that single time and place. You live and experience something. It's never to be repeated again exactly the same way, and always leaving the possibility of chance or contingency or the accidental, meeting someone, experiencing something. All of these things were part of this kind of dual-pronged approach of acting unpredictably and yet acting with complete control over the events that were occurring. Now, the most important thing for Debord was to always stay on the margins in viewing these events as they unfolded. And so, as much as Debord was extremely well read, I don't think he spoke English very well. He knew a few words, but he was fluent in Italian. He spoke French clearly, had a smattering of Spanish, I think, but certainly kept in contact with many different people and many different disciplines, writers and artists and philosophers and thinkers. But he himself kept this very marginal position in relation to institutions that would normally hire someone like him, academic institutions. He wanted to live utterly on his own terms, and basically work because he wanted to, and work on the things he wanted to. So he, in that sense, was revolutionary because he did not buy into the system. He did not buy into this idea of reaching adulthood, going to school, getting a job, getting married, raising a family, and that's it. It's over. Now, not in any way am I saying this is horrible, but this is not something Debord wanted to do. So he wanted to keep himself free and clear of institutional connections, but he also wanted to make sure that he was able to work on his own, and whatever he thought was interesting at the time was what he would pursue. So the influences of this theoretical and practical work that he did, and he began writing as early as the 1952, wrote letters to friends prior to that, but began publishing in 1952 and worked right through to 1994. So a very long time. These days, if you look carefully, and if after you learn about the Situationists, you find that there are ideas that are still echoing through the work of the present day. So our contemporary philosophers, those that are writing and are alive today, have availed themselves of some of the ideas originally proposed and developed by the Situationists. And Debord wrote one time in the Italian translation of The Society of the Spectacle, he wrote, "The SI is like radioactivity. One speaks little of it, but one detects traces of it almost everywhere, and it lasts a long time." So the work I've done on the Situationist over the last probably 2 years now, my book came out in October of this past year of 2021, and I'm now working on a follow-up book. Because I've immersed myself in their work, I see their ideas being expressed in a variety of different ways, literally across the board. The problem is very few people ascribe these ideas to them. They act as if they had come up with them themselves, which is, that's unethical. But many of the ideas that present day contemporary philosophers are discussing have their being and have their inception in the work of the Situationists. So Debord wants to live spontaneously, wants to live in situations, and his attitude towards money and fame and power and prestige, really, those aren't important. He doesn't want to start his own school. He doesn't want to have some sort of dogmatic, theoretical position that is rigid and unchanging, any kind of orthodoxy. No, he did not want to do that. And as a matter of fact, and although it's hard to read here, he is alleged to be the author of the famous graffiti, "Ne travaillez jamais," which translates to "never work." So this was the rallying cry of Debord. Now, when he says "ne travaillez jamais," it doesn't mean don't ever work, don't do anything. What he means is that if you're going to work at something that really matters to you. And of course, he was a filmmaker, he was a writer, he helped friends get their books published. He kept a careful eye on translations of his work, translations of friends' work as well. And really, he was essentially a writer. He was primarily a writer, although he did make films. But the notion of ne travaillez jamais really means don't buy into the system. Never work means work in the kind of drudgery that students and others, but the same age in their early 20s, would be facing, right? The drudgery of getting an office job or working as a cubicle drone somewhere or working in a factory, which was also a possibility back then. That was drudgery at its worst. So that is the kind of work that Debord was rallying against, because he says, look, we have to work because we live in a capitalist system. We've got to pay our rent and buy our food, but choose how you will work. Pick it yourself. And last week we talked about living authentically, right? As existentialists. Although Debord did not consider himself an existentialist, he certainly tapped into this idea of living authentically, right? Living an authentic life where if he was busy doing something, he'd never considered it work. It was important, but not work in the sense of drudgery. This was something that he did not want to do. This was part of his overall attitude. It was also part of his desire to be an intellectual, because he knew that's what it was that he wanted to do. So any kind of job where you get a salary, hourly, monthly, whatever, that's the kind of drudgery that Debord was trying to fight against, because for him that meant you've given up. Right? You've given up. You've bought into the system. You hope the system will take care of you. And no, it just ends up lying to you. This endless dissatisfaction of buying the latest whatever, and you're never happy because you no sooner buy a nice car, somebody down the street buys a nicer car, so you buy an even nicer car, and someone else buys an even. It never ends. It's a vicious circle. So anything where you're working for a salary, that would be that economic system that he was trying to reject. And he never believed in it. He wanted to work as diligently as he could as a filmmaker, as an artist, and as a writer, and show other people that it was possible. Now, as early as 1958, so this is about a year after the Situationists have begun to work, what Debord had worked out was what he called his praxis, which is really, it's Greek for thoughtful action. So his praxis was pretty straightforward, but we need to unpack it. So on Thesis on Cultural Revolution, he says, the goal of the Situationists is immediate participation in a passionate abundance of life by means of deliberately arranged variations of ephemeral moments. So it's a beautiful, almost poetic statement, but that was his rallying cry, his mission statement, or in this case, his praxis, right? His thoughtful action. What is he thinking about? Well, he wants to participate in the passionate abundance of life that's worth living, not drudgery, not standing in line buying the next damn iPhone, but enjoying life to its fullest, whether it's friends or experiences of one sort or another. And you do this by deliberately arranging these moments that are, yes, ephemeral, because they'll never happen again, but being open to the possibility of these moments occurring. Because if you aren't paying attention, often these moments will just fly right by you. If you're busy on your phone or you've got earbuds in and you've kind of tuned out the sounds of the world and you're staring at your phone screen, you've now blocked out at least two of your senses. So your sight and your hearing are now blocked with something else. That's what Debord was talking about. Now, at the time he's writing, there are no earbuds. There certainly are no iPhones in 1958. But there is this idea of people sort of closing themselves down and really passively becoming just simply spectators, right? Everything cool happens somewhere else. Everything worth living is occurring somewhere else. And Debord's going, no, that passionate abundance of life is there right in front of you. You're just not seeing it. So this is what he meant by a cultural revolution. He wanted to revolutionize the way people just experience the world, whether they experienced it through art, through music, through actions, through relationships. It didn't matter. But to respond to the world around you in an authentic, meaningful way, right? In a passionate kind of way. That's the kind of life that Debord was talking about, and really what mattered, no matter what the era was for the Situationists. And there's kind of three main ones, but all the way through these ideas of grasping these passionate moments, that's what was important. So the Situationists considered cultural activity, right, in its totality as an experimental method for constructing this new social category, just everyday life. Because at the time that they are writing, now remember, they're writing in the late 50s and throughout the 60s, the idea of everyday life is a category that almost doesn't even exist in sociology. And it certainly does not exist in philosophy. If you think back to our discussions of Plato and the rationalists and the idealists, everyday life is almost meaningless, right? It's to be discarded, and other grand themes and absolutes are supposed to be thought of. The Situationists wanted to put everyday life front and center. You were not moving through into something else. We are in the moment. We are here in this place. And this new kind of sociological category, there were other sociologists just beginning to describe everyday life as something that had some degree of meaning. Because at the time they're writing, everyday life was essentially meaningless. It wasn't important because it didn't have anything to do with economics, didn't have anything to do with politics. And yet economics and politics weighed heavily on the kinds of everyday lives people had. This is what the Situationists wanted us to realize. As much as it may not be a category, we live in the everyday. We live in that material world. And it is being influenced by these larger institutions that would like to not remind you that that's exactly what they're doing. So the notion of everyday life became the category into which all these different ideas were being placed. And so if we could extend the notion of everyday life, there would be at least an extension of leisure, right? Extension of downtime. Now, as you can imagine, the Situationists were very much for automation. They believed that automation was the best way to go forward, given the degree of the division of labor, for example, which we're going to look at in just a moment. The division of labor had gotten so precise that individuals were almost reduced to doing a single task each day. And now the notion of everyday life is meaningless because people are exhausted at the end of the day. They just want to go home and sleep, to rest up for the next day to come back and do the same boring thing again. By extending the idea of everyday life to perhaps work 2 days and be off 5 days, that's something that would end up helping people, because there would be more time to just sit and reflect and just exist, because that wasn't happening at this point. People were the French population was so enamored by these post-war consumer products that they really lived just for those products. And yet, did it make them any happier? Usually they didn't, or maybe temporarily. So this notion of everyday life, something that we have not seen before in philosophy, just like up until last week, the individual barely existed. These new categories are now coming into being. And so by extending the duration of what's called everyday life, perhaps there could be also the withering away, right? That dissolving away of the division of labor. And this is something we talked about a month ago. We were discussing the Scottish Enlightenment, Adam Smith's favorable view of the division of labor. Because what's happening here is there's a kind of contradiction between the division of labor economically and the division of labor socially. And so that contradiction underlines the interest of the separate individuals or individual families and the common interest of all individuals who interact with one another. And so what ends up happening is the particular and the common interests kind of contradict for one another, because the common interests are typically economic. You need to keep the economy moving. Think about, us, we're looking at this in August, and I'm doing this now in May. I'm recording this in May, and the pandemic's not over. And yet we are being asked to behave as if it were over. And yesterday, over 300 Americans died from COVID. It's not over. We still have people in the hospital. But the common interests often are dictated by economic interests and economic imperatives. So there's a contradiction between the particular individual and the common interests. And the common interest is usually represented by the state. And it is a state that ends up dividing from the real individual and collective interests, that community that really kind of doesn't exist. It's there in name only, because if we are alienated from each other, from ourselves, and between us are just products, right? The products that we buy, the sense of community is kind of an illusion, right? It's not as strong and deeply felt as it used to be maybe 100, 200 years ago. So the community upon or out of which the state is allegedly speaking, right, on behalf of, is really just this collective illusion. We think we're living in a community, in a social formation, when in fact we're kind of on our own, right? And we are the ones that need to make a better life for ourselves. In the US, for example, this notion of the individual is so drastic that there are no social programs that link people together. Sure, there are, of course, communities, but the communities, again, are just illusions. Every man for himself, right? It's just as the old saying goes. And that can be terrifying. So if that's the case, then you need to grasp the fact that, yes, you are an individual, you are a person, but you need to live authentically, because otherwise you will get caught up in these common interests that run counter to who you are as a person. So the division of labor is the first example of that split between our interests to be with our family, to sleep in, to have that extra donut or something, and the common interests. And so those common interests will quite often be contrary to our own beliefs. I know there are some students that are not looking forward. Again, you're watching this in August, and I'm recording this in May, at the end of May. And I know right now there are students who are reluctant to go back to school in September. They would prefer to continue online until this pandemic is completely over. But there is that common desire, that common push brought on by the state and institutions that represent the state to ask us to behave in a certain way. And eventually, our behaviors will almost feel like alien to us, because it's not something we really want to do. If we're existentialists, like we were discussing last week, we're behaving contrary to what we wish to do. We're behaving in bad faith is what we're doing, because we know that we would like to do something else, but we don't have the options or the possibilities of acting any differently than what's being required of us. And so those decisions we make are almost alien, right? They're done for us. Those decisions are made for us. And in a sense, we are kind of enslaved to whatever the market, whatever the common interests are of that community. And a quote from Marx here, this would be from Economics and Philosophical Manuscripts, I believe. "For as soon as the division of labor comes into being," writes Marx, "each man has a particular exclusive sphere of activity which is forced upon him and for which he cannot escape." Now, when he talks about a particular exclusive sphere, he's talking about a job, right? The division of labor. This is what I do. This is who I am. I put rivets onto a wheel, or I fix something, but the division of labor makes everyone exclusive, right? It's not inclusive. Even though it is a division of labor and is very efficient in terms of production, it alienates people from one another. And wherever you're working, whatever you're building, you really can never make the claim that you built it. All you've done is put a few bolts into something and pass it on to the next person. So it is a particular exclusive sphere of activity, but one that once you enter into the workforce is exclusive to you, but you are then at the same time disconnected from others. So these are pretty radical ideas. At no point is Debord saying, set fire to a post office or destroy everything. He was very careful, right? And his focus primarily was on cultural ideas. And a cultural revolution is one where modes of thinking change, whether it is in art or philosophy or politics or society, all the institutions that surround us and make us who we are. Those are the things that Debord wanted to spend time on. So he moved towards a more critical understanding of the role that capitalism had on these cultural activities within society. Because 100 or so years ago, capitalism really wasn't interested in art. It was interested in commodities, in industry. But as it moved forward inexorably, it seeped into virtually every part of our social lives. And everything now was touched and tinged with these capitalist interests. Suddenly, art, pieces of art went for tremendous amounts of money, and there were auction houses set up, to sell these things to the highest bidder. So that critical understanding that Debord had of the way in which capitalism moves and is pervasive within society, and of course the influence that it has on social individuals, was something that they wished to understand more clearly. And the way in which to do it is to look at the means by which capitalism sells its message, right? Sells its need to be there. And this is where the cultural aspect really matters, because the messaging for capitalism isn't done necessarily economically. It's done through mass media. And so these social and political relations that we enter into and the interactions that we have with one another are now sort of mystified by this sort of ephemeral message that capitalism has of, yes, friends are good, but, don't forget, you got to keep busy. And ultimately, the position that we have to take is one where we are excluded from real control, right? We are excluded from real control over the vast material powers of our time. Think about today, right? The 1%ers, right? The 1% that seem to own everything. And we may live in a country that is still quite wealthy and progressive and well off. But when we look around, we realize that very few people have tremendous control over many, many things that have a direct impact on our lives. And we don't share in any of that material power. So what do, right? All we can do is look around and see, okay, can I do something to break through this facade that tells people that everything's okay and this is the way it should be? Can I break through that facade and through that messaging and disrupt it in some way so that people can understand what's really going on? So the idea that I just read from Marx in the German ideology, economic and philosophical manuscripts, these are all written 1844, 1846. These are ideas that Debord was borrowing from Marx. And he talks about the production of ideas, of consciousness, right? All of that is directly the result of the material activities of social activity, of social individuals. So the language of real life are these interactions that people have. And individuals here, in speaking to one another, because they live in true communities and they speak to one another, individuals here are the producers of their own ideas. By the time Debord was writing, we no longer are the producers of our own ideas. We have those ideas handed to us. We have them handed to us through mass media. That's what they're after. This is the message that they're trying to give to us. And they're saying, look, the production of ideas is no longer the creation of individuals speaking to one another, right? The language of real life. No, those ideas that we entertain and think about are given to us already done. And it's essentially already sold. So Debord was greatly influenced by the German ideology, economic and philosophical manuscripts. These are really important books to him. And he realizes that what Marx is discussing is gotten almost even worse in the present state that he's living in the 1950s and 60s. And he was looking, for example, to Marx to try to better understand the situation they was in historically and in terms of human nature. So Marx writes, the exponents of this conception of history have consequently only been able to see in history the spectacular political events and religion and other historical struggles. Notice the word spectacular. And even Marx was dimly aware at this point of the notion of the spectacle, the distractions that we have all the time. For example, I'm doing this in May. I'm sure it's going to be over by this point. But right now, over the last 2 weeks, everyone in the world has been fascinated by the Johnny Depp Amber Heard court trials that are being broadcasted live on YouTube. Meanwhile, there are mass shootings. Ukraine is being overrun by Russian troops. There are climate change issues, serious issues, and yet everyone is fascinated by this court case happening in LA. That's what he means, what both Marx and Debord meant by the spectacular political events. They can be social events, but they are spectacles. They really have no bearing on the world, but we somehow can't seem to get enough of it. And we're buying into it. We're buying into the fact that it's a spectacle. And so in particular, Marx continues with regard to each historical epoch, they were compelled to share the illusions of that epoch. The illusions that meritocracy still exists. No, it doesn't. The fact that if you work really hard, you'll get what you want, which is, again, meritocracy. No, it's a struggle. We don't know. We hope for the best that things are going to work out, but we never know. There are no guarantees. And yet we are sold through media, through Hollywood cinema and TV shows and so on, this dream that, that everybody has a chance. And if you can dream it, be it, and so on. No, you can go ahead and do that. But there are no guarantees. And again, to think this way is to think more like an existentialist than a situationist. Existentialists know that life is a struggle. They learned that from Schopenhauer. Debord says the same thing, but what he does is call attention to that distracting spectacle that we call society, that is now always diverting or distracting us from what really matters. And so Debord tries to interpret Marx's view of non-history, right, as a series of spectacular political events. That's really where he starts to do his most serious work. And The Society of the Spectacle is a book he put out in 1967, and it is essentially a major critique of capitalism and consumer society. And what he says is, in the same way as ideas are no longer generated by us, sort of on the street level through real communications with one another, but in fact are broadcasted to us through mass media on behalf of other forces who just happen to be in charge. Debord also thought that life in a consumer society was being more and more dominated by what he called the spectacle. And he says in section 1, the whole life of those societies in which modern conditions of production prevail presents itself as an immense accumulation of spectacles. All that once was directly lived has become mere representation. So that's literally the opening statement of The Society of the Spectacle. And the passage I read from you before from Marx's German ideology, not economic philosophical manuscripts, I apologize, but the statement that Debord makes is an echo, right? It's a detouring of Marx's original idea that the modern conditions of production prevail, the division of labor prevails, and as a result, because life is boring and there's a certain amount of drudgery and alienation, there is, to replace this notion of community that really isn't there, there's a kind of illusion of a community that is created through this immense accumulation of spectacles. Whether we all share the fact that, hey, I watched Game of Thrones last night. What'd you think of it? Oh, I watched The Voice or America's Got Talent or something else. Those are the spectacles that glue us together. But is that really a community? No, it's just people that shared something, right? And of course, we shared the commercials that went along with it. But this is what Debord is alluding to, the fact that our sense of community, our sense of power over our lives is really an illusion. And the end result is that these spectacles are there to distract us from that fact and to try to reconstitute us, not as members of a community, but simply as passive consumers. All that once was directly lived has become mere representation. Words are given to us, ideas are given to us, ways of life are given to us, and really, we're not the ones coming up with these ideas. So for Debord to reject it all and say, no, I would like to be a writer and filmmaker, however difficult it is, and it was not easy, that's what I want to do. So the spectacle for Debord is a kind of visual language, right, that is created in and through this post-industrial society. And the notion of spectacles, and these are great events, no matter what it is, lots of pomp and circumstances, and we all share in it. But really, what are we sharing? We're sharing the fact that we are simply spectators on the sidelines. We're not really participating. We're simply watching, right? So to sit passively by the sidelines is to be a passive consumer of the spectacle. We didn't create the spectacle. We didn't have a say in it. We didn't interact with it. We simply watched it on the sidelines or on our phones or on TV. So this really leads to a kind of false consciousness, right, of citizens, that we think we belong together, and in fact we don't. We belong together only through the participation that we have with mass media. We all share the same things, right? We all experience the same things, but they're all still spectacles. So all of this leads to a kind of false consciousness. And this is an idea that became very, very important for Marx and also became even more important for Debord, this notion of a false consciousness, this idea that you are aware of the world, but in fact, the ideas that you have aren't really generated by you. They are generated by others and handed to you so that you can think only a certain way and not another. And if you think that other way, then you could be considered a radical, a heretic if you were living in the 1500s, or worst case scenario, possibly a terrorist. And that's, of course, an extreme version. But a false consciousness, right? That's the way in which material, ideological, and institutional processes are misleading, right, members of society. And what they're trying to do is conceal the fact that you're kind of being exploited. Now, some people get paid very well, but if you end up with a kind of, what's commonly known as a McJob, you're not making a whole lot of money. Somebody else is making lots of money. And if you want to be really crass and sort of negative about it, ultimately that 1%, right, you're working for that 1%. And so we are constantly bombarded with these images of freedom, of liberty, of being able to do whatever you want, buy a new car and you can take off wherever you want. But really, you're just buying a car, right? You're just buying a vehicle that's going to cost you a bundle to keep on the road. So for Debord, the spectacle isn't merely a single representation. He says in section 4, the spectacle is not a collection of images. Rather, it is a social relationship between people that is mediated by images. So what happens is those otherwise true and abiding and deeper connections we have with one another in the community has now been replaced by images, now been replaced by commodities. So we have an indirect relationship with one another, one that is mediated by products. Right? Look down the street. Oh, this guy's got a bigger car. I better buy an even bigger car. Look at this guy over there. He's got a different car. He's got a Sea-Doo. Oh, he's got a motorcycle. Oh, I got to get a motorcycle. That is what he means. the image that is associated with buying these particular products, you buy a motorcycle, freedom, and all, spontaneity and youth and exuberance. It's just a motorcycle. But the images used to sell the idea of the motorcycle, that's what's considered the spectacle. And ultimately, what happens is we are overloaded, right? We're overloaded by these spectacles. And the only way that we can get out of it is, as he says, to not buy into it. And we don't want to buy into it. And for Debord, it meant not buying into, the salary job or the drudgery work. No, what we need to do is realize that the relationship we have to images rather than people, right, are acting as a substitute for real social relations. Well, we can't have a social relationship with an image or with an idea. We can only have a social relationship with other people. But those other people, we find it harder and harder to connect with because they're either busy at work or they're busy out buying a new product because they've just finished work and they've saved up the money. We're caught up in imagery, we're caught up in commodities, and we are enamored by these products. I mean, when you think about, Black Friday, I forget exactly when it is, but it's in November. It's a day after Thanksgiving in the U.S. Black Friday or Boxing Day. I mean, yes, you're in a building full of other people, but what are you there for? To buy consumer products. You have no relationship with these people other than get out of my way, I want that TV. That's what's happening. The relationship to images rather than to people acts as a substitute for real social relations. This is the problem. So mass media keeps pumping these images out at us about this wonderful way of life, and living in this particular society is fantastic. But in so doing, it's also transforming the way we respond to one another, the way that we act towards one another. And they are very distracting. And what are they distracting us from? Well, social isolation, enemy, alienation, frustration. And at the end, what do? Right? We buy that bucket of Haagen-Dazs and we scarf it down because we're depressed. Again, we buy the bucket of ice cream or the Taco Bell or whatever it is because somehow we think it's going to help us. It's going to alleviate that isolation, frustration, depression, whatever it may be. But it's just a product. It is just a product that will simply fill your stomach for the time being, but will not address the real problem, which is that degree of frustration or depression that you're feeling. So for Debord, writing in section 10, the spectacle is an affirmation of appearances and an identification of all human social life with appearances. And as you can see, it's an easy target. It's a low-hanging fruit. I'm sorry, but Keeping Up with the Kardashians is perhaps the best example of the society of the spectacle. These individuals are selling you products, somehow trying to convince you that if you buy the same lipstick or the same, Spanx or shoes or whatever, it doesn't matter, that somehow you'll be like the Kardashians. No, you'll just be out 10 or 20 or 50 bucks because you've sent it to them. And there's a reason why each one of these individuals in that family are either millionaires or billionaires, because they are really good at selling products. But products is all they're selling. They seem to be attaching a way of life to the products that are implying that if you buy this product, you can be like us. No, it's just a lipstick. It's just a pair of shoes or a purse or whatever. But the spectacle buys into this idea of appearances. And one of the most heinous inventions, and it's not because of my age, because you probably know full well what it's like, social media platforms like TikTok, Instagram, Pinterest, and I'm not saying all of you watching this are, directly responsible for this, but generally speaking, we can think of quite a few people who are completely superficial, who will sell you a lifestyle or are influencers. Those are products of the society of the spectacle. Now, I don't want to sound like an old boomer. I know I do, but these are the things that concern Debord. And he was young when he was writing this in the 1960s. He would have been only in his 30s, but he was deeply concerned. Now remember, he's writing this, wrote it in 1966, published 1967. But even then, right, this spectacle is an affirmation of appearances, of superficiality, of thinness and emptiness. And I don't mean thinness as in size, but just It's just a veil. It's a veil that is placed over top of the reality of human life being a lot less than what it's cracked up to be. So there is a kind of sinister realm, right, under these layers of spectacular life, this veil that is put in front of us or between us and other people. And what happens is, as the meaning in people's lives begin to decline more and more, we begin to kind of hang on to things, and we buy something we enjoyed as a kid because somehow it's going to give us some sort of mental solace. And so the decline in the meaning of people's lives start to lead more and more to the adoption of the culture industry and mass media, our fascination with celebrities, the fascination with Amber Heard and Johnny Depp and their court case, which again is happening right now, and for me, truly bizarre, because there are so many other far more serious things that are happening. But if you were to ask someone, what's the latest update on the Ukraine? I'm not sure. What's happening with Amber Heard? Oh, boom, I got it. That's kind of sad. Now, over a period of time, Debord believed that the spectacle of images, it came in two different kinds. There was the concentrated spectacle and then the diffuse spectacle. So the concentrated one was one that is more clearly identified with bureaucracy, where he says the dictatorship of the bureaucratic economy cannot leave the exploited masses any significant margin of choice because it has had to make all of the choices itself. Again, ideas and language are not in the here and now of that community speaking to one another in an honest and authentic ways. No, bureaucracy and everything that it entails has created ideas, has then reduced language to the language of economics, to the point where people don't really know how to even speak to one another anymore. So the dictatorship, right, the control of this bureaucratic economy, and of course, out of bureaucracy come behavioral traits and basically, intellectual traits as well. All of these concentrations in this single spectacle, right, of the bureaucracy making choices that much more difficult because we have to follow through whatever bureaucracy tells us. Think about making a phone call to speak to someone within a bureaucratic system. Oh, you got to call this person and that person and dial one and dial here and go. And you spend 2 or 3 hours going from one phone call to the next, having to repeat your story. You're trying to cancel something or get information or getting a refund. It's maddening because bureaucracy has been designed to drive you mad. Until finally, the thing you really wanted to do, you just give up. You just give up and say, forget it. I can't do this. So that concentrated spectacle is designed to thwart any kind of actual, real, authentic behavior. The other one is called the diffused spectacle. And that's with basically commodities. Commodities that are everywhere, right? They are diffused across society. And this is all part of capitalism's desire to continually produce more and more products. So individual commodity, no matter what, is set against this background of total commodity. And what ends up happening is we simply buy into a catalog of objects, right? A catalog of products to buy. Our lives are reduced to simply consuming. And that's pretty sad. We're partly consumers and we're partly spectacles. We don't engage with these things in any real sense other than consuming them. And of course, these days, things aren't built to last. They're built to fall apart, planned obsolescence and the rest of it. And then you buy another one or you buy the newest model and you keep coming back and coming back. And somehow buying a new product gives you meaning in your life. And that's kind of sad. To wait for the latest, whatever, the Marvel Universe movie or something. And yes, there are lots of those. When your life is now gravitating around the release of something, the meaning of your life has really been downgraded. It's been degraded to simply consuming products. What about friends? What about yourself? What about your desires? What about your passions, your cravings? Those are the things that Debord was worried about. If our lives are centered around the consumption of products, our lives are without meaning. And the only meaning that it has is buying more things. That's kind of sad. Now, typically, the idea of a car, it's used to sell, freedom, individuality, hedonism, independence, or whatever. But it's just a car. It literally is just a car. So he says, For the actual consumer can access only a fragment of that commodity heaven, right? This is all the superficial, secondary, kind of metaphysical parts, the aspects of the car, the freedom, individuality, independence. But you're not buying into that. You're simply buying a car. But those dreams and those spectacles and those ideas are used to sell the product to you. So the actual consumer can access only a fragment of this commodity heaven, fragments which invariably lack the quality attributed to the whole. So the totality of buying a car is to buy into this particular lifestyle. And instead, you simply have bought a car. And that's where it ends. But you can think of other products where a certain lifestyle is associated with purchasing a product. Back in the 1970s, before beer ads and cigarette ads were banned on television, the same thing would happen. Young people, young beautiful folks, right? Facebook folks that are hedonistic and individual and independent would all drink beer or smoke cigarettes. And again, the same thing was happening. You were being sold a lifestyle, not a product. And ultimately, this continues to happen, and we are simply left on the sidelines as spectators, right? We are spectators in our own society because we have less and less interaction or influence over the way in which this world is going. And so Debord wanted to move into some kind of area where he could at least stop this increasing alienation of the individual to society. So really the best way to describe this is working against the spectacle, right? Trying to break through that veneer, that veil that is over our eyes, to break through. And so one of the ways in which they did it, there were two, commodification and instrumental rationality. Let's take a look at these two, and let's start with commodification. Now, this is an idea that, it starts in political economy, but the version we're going to look at is the one that's associated with Marx. And he says, commodification is a transformation of goods, services, ideas, and people into commodities or objects that can be exchanged for money. So, for example, you can go and apply for a job, and because you can labor, whether it's physical labor, intellectual labor, or a combination of both, you can temporarily sell yourself, right, as a commodity to another person in exchange for an hourly wage or a monthly salary of some sort. And so a commodity is really anything that can be exchanged for money because it is assigned an economic value. So our labor skill, right, our skill set, right, we call them, hard skills, soft skills, but it's a skill set that we can sell to another person. Now, we don't sell ourselves completely, but we sell our ability to do something temporarily for money. So that's a commodity. And so that's the first thing that Debord wanted to pay attention to was, to what degree are we selling ourselves as opposed to simply our labor? If we end up in a factory where the division of labor is so precise and so comprehensive that you will end up simply just doing a simple little task over and over and over again until you finally are driven mad and you just want out of there. So that's commodification. Now, not only are you feeling like you yourself are a commodity because you've sold your labor for X amount of money, but you are usually creating more commodities through your labor. So it becomes an endless cycle. So that's commodification, taking something and selling it because it has some sort of use value and economic value. Now, the other one is instrumental rationality. I know it sounds like a pretty difficult idea, but it's actually something that's fairly straightforward. Instrumental rationality refers to the pursuit of any efficient means necessary to achieve a specific end. Whatever incentives that a person gives to someone else to behave in a certain way, that is what instrumental rationality is. So we live in a society that, because that society is built on a very strong economic foundation, late capitalism, behaviors expected of individuals are such that we should go and get a job, salaried or otherwise, and we should work because we want to produce, we want to participate, we want to give back to the community, all those things. So we are not tricked, but we are motivated to behave in a certain way. Because if you make all this money, you can afford to buy, you can afford to buy a house, or until recently you could. So instrumental rationality is any kind of influence that is placed upon you to behave in a certain way. So this is something that Debord looked at because he thought, well, the spectacle is basically doing the same thing, right? It is causing us to become more and more disconnected from one another, and that emptiness in our lives, we're filling up with products, and ultimately we're simply passive consumers sitting on the sidelines of society, watching the parade going by. We are not participating in any way. Now, the notion here of instrumental rationality, I just want to pursue it a little bit further. Max Weber, a sociologist, says that instrumental rationality is a type of social action that is determined by expectations as to the behavior of objects in the environment and of other human beings. These expectations are used as conditions or mean for the attainment of the actor's own rationally pursued and calculated ends. Now, this could be a really, really fancy way of talking about Adam Smith's invisible hand, that we wish to buy a product so we know where to go, and yet at the same time, that same invisible hand is bringing someone that wishes to sell a product or a good, right? Goods and services. Those people just naturally move towards one another because we have rationally pursued ends, and instrumental rationality creates a condition or a situation in which these two people come together and they can exchange goods and or services in exchange for money usually. And so instrumental rationality is used within social formations to achieve those ends, right? It now changes the behavior of objects, or in this case subjects, in their environment to bring them together, right? To bring them together to either go to work or to sell a product. So if that's the case, then perhaps we can begin to break apart this notion of commodification, break apart this notion of instrumental rationality. And in the case of instrumental rationality, right, if it is something that is forcing people to work against their will because they're not comfortable, and again, think about what I mentioned a few moments ago, that in the fall when you're watching this again in August, next month in September. I don't know at this point in May whether we will be back in school. The tendency is yes. The behavior is that of institutions is that the pandemic is essentially over and we need to prepare to come back to school. Now that's a kind of instrumental rationality where the positive aspects of being back in school, which of course is something I want to have happen, but it is presented to us in such a way that we can see that there are incentives for this to happen. Even if many of us are not comfortable with the idea, we can see that it is a message being sold to us that it's okay. We'll be safe. Everything will be fine. Get your shots. Wear your mask if you like. So instrumental rationality may not be a bad thing in and of itself. But if you are forcing people to behave in a certain way that they are not comfortable with, or that is leading to what the existentialists would call bad faith, that's not a good thing. That's not so good. So the ideologies of recognized authorities, law, institutions, social conventions, we have to think about what kind of a message they're giving to us about what is considered good and proper behavior. If I buck the trend and act in a different way, how will people see me? Will I be looked at as a freeloader, as a bum, a parasite, or worse? We need to match up our behaviors with the expectations that those social institutions, those social and economic institutions, expect of us. And sometimes when they match up, it may be something you're not crazy about, but you know you have to do because you've got to feed yourself, right? You have to buy into it. But if you can make that behavior a means to an end rather than an end in itself, there's at least a possibility of breaking away from this drive that the institutions that we have to ask you to behave in a certain way, of course, with those little incentives, the carrot and the stick kind of thing. If we can do this, but on our own terms, we likely will have some degree of complacency and pride in our work because we're living by our own rules as best we can. So Commodification and instrumental rationality are certainly tools of capitalism at its worst. And so Debord thought, okay, we need to figure out some way to break this. And so they came up with a couple of really interesting ideas. One is Derive, and Derive is French for drifting, or the state of being adrift. And the other is Detournement. And Detournement can be translated to deflection, diversion, rerouting. Perhaps the worst case scenario would be hijacking, right? Taking something, and moving it in the opposite direction. So these are two different strategies. One is a social statement, and the other is a kind of literary, artistic, cultural statement. So let's take a look at these. The first one is Derive. So the situationists, in trying to fight this increasingly artificial aspect, the illusion of communities, the illusion of a real social life, the situationists were trying to come up with new conceptions of space and of time, new forms of moral, social, political, and economic behavior. And the way in which they would do it was to tap in to the moment, right? The momentary, authentic elements of real everyday life. So the main activity for situationists now, they eventually, at least from my understanding, in the late 50s and early 60s, Derive and Detournement were quite important. They actually both of these belong more to the Letterist International, but they did seep into the first few years of the Situationists and are still worth considering. So this notion of dérive, right, or purposeful drifting, just think about that for a second. Purposeful drifting, or what I call loitering with intent. So you are purposely letting yourself just go with the breeze, right? Go with whatever's happening. And this kind of behavior is completely the opposite of instrumental rationality. What is instrumental rationality? Incentives and coaxings of the individual to act in a certain way. So to engage in dérive is to do the exact opposite, to just let what's going to happen. And I may end up, going home with this person. I may hang around here. I may sort of wander off somewhere else because it looks interesting and exciting. And so what happens here is dérive breaks that rigid expectation of the passive consumer to behave in a certain way. If you engage in dérive, you're engaging in purposeful drifting. You're just letting the moment take you somewhere. And you can interact with objects, with subjects. You can interact with the landscape. You become very aware of how the landscape is influencing your mind and your emotional states. So what it is, it's making yourself utterly open to those authentic moments that are there, but we don't see them because we're busy flying by in a car or on a bus or racing off to work. That's not dérive. That's the opposite, right? That's buying into the incentives to go to work. And so the goal of dérive, right, was to try to live in a more kind of exotic locale, think more exotically, move towards things that are hidden or less well known, find anything that has a certain atmosphere that is different from what you had experienced before. So even though they sound kind of irrational, a little bit strange, they're intentionally and consciously designed to fight against the effects of instrumental rationality. So it was one thing to identify the problems in society, but the situationists, and Debord in particular, came up with strategies to break that mold, right? To lift that veil from people's eyes and say, no, you can engage in dérive, and usually a dérive would last 24 hours, maybe a weekend at the most. And these were just moments, right? Just these instinctual, authentic moments where there would be 2 or 3 people that would just simply go, okay, you know what? Let's close our eyes, hop on the bus, and without even looking, just randomly pull the bell, right? Ding, I'm going to get off here. Where are we? Oh, I don't know. Let's find out. Let's explore, right? So the notion of exploring and finding exotic locales, even within Paris, because there are many parts of Paris that are quite exotic and different and unusual. And instead of driving from A to B every single day, home, work, back and forth, no, explore and investigate. That's dérive. Now, along with this sort of exotic or exoticism, right, this sort of rediscovery of things that are always already there, The situationists also believed in what they called psychogeography. And they call this the study of the specific effects of geographical environments, whether consciously organized or not, on the emotions and behavior of individuals. So what this was an awareness of how the surrounding atmosphere is influencing your behavior and your emotional states. Are you elated? Are you scared? Are you apprehensive? Are you, really ready to investigate? The geographical environment, which of course is a brand new place, will influence your emotions and behaviors. And again, this is something that instrumental rationality did not account for. In fact, doesn't want to account for because it doesn't think it's important. But if you believe in the individual that has an ability to respond in an authentic and instinctual way, then psychogeography is the way in which you not only drift purposefully, but you are always aware of what you're feeling. And what this does is makes the world a bit more exciting, right? It repassions the world, repassions life. And one of the SI members, Ivan Chechklov, wrote, this need for total creation has always been intimately associated with the need to play, with architecture, with time, with space. And so the situationists, Chechklov, Debord, and the rest of them, wanted to almost radically reevaluate what time and space meant. Because if you have time on your hands, time is elastic. Time can move in all kinds of different ways. The notion of space, which is new and to be discovered because of psychogeography, all those things are brand new to you. And so it is an integrated ensemble of behavior. So it's it's thinking about emotional states, psychological states, where you are, how you feel, who you are with, all those things that are not about commodities, not about passivity, not about being a spectator. You are in the moment. You are not spectating, you are participating. And this is why Derive and psychogeography were so important to the situationists. Now, Detournement is the other one. There's, a second approach, which is more sort of artistic and aesthetic. And Detournement is a detouring, right? Detouring, hijacking, rerouting of a particular idea. And this is something that the situationists had borrowed from the Dadaists and Surrealists. And this was something that had started around World War I, as I mentioned at the very beginning. And what happens here is there's an attempt to ridicule the kind of meaning that is attributed to this modern world. Now, this is a technical, logical, scientific, capital-oriented world. And that world, imagine after World War I, would be somewhat meaningless. Well, the Dadaists celebrated that. They didn't want to have anything to do with any kind of institution or way of thinking that would lead them to another war. And so the situationists really enjoyed that because Detournement was a way to kind of hijack those messages, those cultural messages that were occurring in mass media to tell us to act a certain way, think a certain way, feel a certain way, speak a certain way. Detournement detours all of this. It reroutes this entire enterprise into stupidity and laughter. And of course, meaninglessness. So anything to challenge an individual's passive conditioning, of course, these very carefully calculated scandals, all of these were part of what Detournement was trying to achieve, right? Rerouting these messages of rationality, continue working, you'll be happy, this is great, buy a car because everyone will love you. No, you're just going to buy a car. Now, Detournement means deflection, diversion, rerouting, misappropriation, hijacking, whatever you can do to turn something aside from its normal, calculated, instrumental course or purpose is considered détournement. So you can reroute and deflect a message and ultimately make it say what it really is trying to say. And this is a piece of art by Barbara Kruger, who was I've never been able to find anywhere whether she states explicitly that she followed the situationist mandate, but certainly her ideas are excellent representations of Detournement in the 1980s. And so this is at a time in America where the economy was booming, the Republicans were in charge, and everybody is buying lots and lots of things, and people are drowning in consumer products. And along comes Barbara Kruger with a simple statement: I shop, therefore I am. So think of Descartes: I think, therefore I am. There's a rerouting, right? A deflection of not thinking, but shopping. That's what the message is really telling me to do. They don't want me to think. They want me to be passive. I don't want to don't be a participant, be a spectator. Let us take care of it. So anything that reroutes, breaks through, hijacks in some way that message and makes it say what it really is about, that would be détournement. So it's not diversion, because it's not meant for idle entertainment. It's meant for people to think about. That's really what is going on. So Detournement communicates in its own language through contradiction. And so what is happening with this kind of rerouting of the message is it is not a negation of style, according to Debord, but a style of negation. So what is happening here is the message that is being broadcasted is being criticized. So there are three things that are going on. So first of all, you create out of those elements a new coherent whole. You take the message and you look at it in its totality, and you now kind of like a jigsaw puzzle, rebuild it. You use the same pieces, but you get it to say and look like something else. So you create out of the elements that are there a brand new coherent whole. And in two, you criticize both the existing world and your own critical relationship to it. So you are kind of doing double duty, right? You're negating the original message because it itself is essentially a lie. Buy this car and be happy and people will love you. No, you're just buying a damn car. That's all it is. So it de-alienates, right? It subverts the message by disconnecting it from all those instrumental rationality ideas, behave in a certain way, think in a certain way. And those messages of conditioning, conformity, compliance are now thrown right back at you as their opposites, right? Not I think before I am, but I shop because I am, or therefore I am, right? Your body is a battleground. Well, your body is typically your own, but it's a battleground to be contested by other people. So these messages, and this is again another piece by Barbara Kruger, powerful stuff. Just Google her name, Kruger. Her work is phenomenal. And really, again, I don't know if she was a situationist. I know she was not part of the group because they folded in 1972, but certainly her ideas are very much coming from the same approach. So Debord's understanding of intellectual theft, right, that is essentially what is happening. It's not the same as plagiarism as we typically know it, but what it is, it's taking the person's work, another person's thoughts or ideas, and trying to make it say what it really is trying to say. So you're uncovering, right? You're unveiling the true message. So plagiarism is, in fact, an act of reversal and transformation. You take the object, right? An advertising, some kind of ad, you break it apart, and you rebuild it differently. And in so doing, you expose the real message. Now here, I'm not sure how easy it is to see, but it says, adorn your prison. Another piece by Barbara Kruger about the cosmetics industry and the way in which women are almost enslaved to this industry to always try to look better and more beautiful. So adorn your prison. That is really the message that the cosmetics industry wish to tell you, but obviously they can't come out and tell you that because you'd go, wait a minute, I'm a free person, I can make up my mind. But no, the message is hidden, right? It's hidden behind all this instrumental rationality of course you want to be beautiful. Of course you want to look like your favorite movie star. Of course women who wear lipstick or look a certain way, blondes have more fun. All these kinds of ideas are trying to present to you a hidden message. What the situationists do through this kind of aesthetic form of plagiarism is they turn the message on its head. And they turn around and they recontextualize this message so that it says its opposite. Now, although Debord says there's no climbing out of the spectacle, we know that it is here and we have to live with it. There are ways in which we can disrupt it temporarily. And that is why Detournement and Derive and Psychogeography are so important. These were three strategies, Derive and Psychogeography being that social component, and Detournement, the sort of artistic, cultural aspect of it. Anything that can disrupt that spectacle and break it apart and make it say what it really is trying to say, which is follow this and do that, behave in a certain way. Any of those are good because they are cultural disruptions. They don't destroy the universe. They don't split the earth in half. It is simply the disruption of the message, the cultural message that the spectacle is trying to give to us. And as a result, it becomes a kind of modern avant-garde artistic strategy. And so this kind of work is what Debord and the Situationists were very much concerned with. And really, this was something that they did use, Detournement perhaps more so than Derive, throughout the existence, that 15-year existence of the SI. So these days, we call it culture jamming. It is a kind of propaganda, but it is a propaganda that reprocesses that image, right? It manipulates and plagiarizes that image that is presented to the world and then turns around and makes it say something completely new. So we contradict the power imbalance by we being the ones that go in and break that veneer, break that facade, that veil. We break it apart. We tear it apart by inserting ourselves, by culture jamming into that message and making it say what it really is trying to say. So we're contradicting the powers that be because we can't participate in them or participate in those power structures. We can at least temporarily destroy them. And so that social identity that is constructed by media is now broken apart because we are no longer spectators. We are participants. We participate in the spectacle by breaking it apart. Okay, so that is Module 14, Guy Debord and the Situationist International. This for me is a culmination of all the ideas that we presented in this course about society and social enemy, about capitalism and industry, about existence and about identity and social formations, all the things that matter in philosophy. And of course, by this time, philosophy is only one of many different forms of understanding the world around us. Anthropology, political economy, sociology, all of these things are around as well as philosophy. But I wanted to end with these individuals because they really, to my mind, encapsulate and take further all the ideas that we presented so far in this course. So hope you enjoyed it. Looking forward to the Zoom meeting on this topic, and then we can kind of unpack these ideas a little bit more. So take care, everyone, and we'll see you soon.